In this video, I'm going to go over my Meteoric Knight build, so let's get to it. Now, the reason this build is called the Meteoric Knight is because it's built around the ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, which is probably my favorite weapon in the DLC. I've always been a fan of the Colossal Sword moveset, and this one is just one of the best. It does an insane amount of damage, and it looks really good too. Perhaps one of the most important things about this Greatsword is that it's fairly easy to obtain, and you can get it for yourself within probably an hour of starting the DLC. But that is not all. It is more than good enough to carry you through the entirety of the DLC as well, including the final boss. So to go about getting it, all you have to do is travel to Ruined Forge of Starfall Pass, and you will have to beat Relina before you can access this section of the map. The ruins themselves are a bit of a maze, but the weapon is at the very end, so you can't miss it. As for the weapon itself, it requires 35 strength, 10 dexterity, and 19 arcane to wield, but it scales primarily with strength, so this is going to be a very strength focused build. However, it is also worth mentioning that this weapon has a weight of 22, which is one of the heaviest weapons in the game, and we will need to invest quite a bit into endurance in order to deal with that. We do of course have to talk about the Ash of War White Light Charge, which might actually be my favorite Ash of War in the game now. It does a ton of damage, it's really good for closing distance, and the explosion itself has decent range while almost guaranteeing you a stagger, so it's definitely very powerful. Now, because I like to make my builds as powerful as possible, I will also be including the incantations Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength in the build as well, to really maximize both our damage and survivability. As for the Sacred Seal, you can use any seal that you can equip because scaling does not affect buffs in any way, but personally I use the Dragon Communion Seal because it has a weight of 0. For the Wanderer's Physic, I'm going to recommend the Opaline Bubble tier because it's great for soaking up damage just in case you get hit by a strong attack during the Ash of War animation, because it does leave you open for quite a while, which could definitely lead to you taking a lot of damage if you don't time your attacks accordingly. The other tier I like to use is the Stone Barbed Cracked tier, and it's great for a lot of builds because it simply makes getting poise breaks easier. Moving on to the armor, I like to use Relina's armor set because it has 51 poise and good damage reduction while still having a fairly low weight. So we won't have to worry about fat rolling or having to invest a lot more into endurance. Plus, getting this armor is also pretty easy because it of course only requires that you kill Relina, which is a boss you will fight very early on in the DLC. Getting into the talismans, we have the Shard of Alexander to boost White Light Charge damage, which we will be using a lot with this build. Next up, we have a new talisman, which is the Two-Handed Sword Talisman. It makes all of your attacks with two-handed weapons do more damage, and more damage is always better. You can just grab it out of a chest in the Temple Town ruins. It will be in the highest structure. For the third talisman slot, I'm going to recommend you the Blade of Mercy, which is yet another new talisman, and this one increases your damage after performing a critical strike by a massive 20% for 20 seconds. So you will definitely want to take full advantage of this by immediately going for a poise break at the beginning of boss fights. As for getting this talisman, it is also pretty easy to get. You can just grab it out of a chest in the Scorched Ruins. And for the last talisman slot, I'm going to recommend you 2 different talismans, and you can choose whichever you prefer. The first one is going to be the Carrion Filigree Crest, which is going to give you enough FP to use the Ash of War an additional time, so you'll get 5 uses per FP bar instead of 4, which could help you significantly with boss fights. The other talisman I'm going to recommend is the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman because it really does give you a massive amount of survivability, and a lot of the enemies in this DLC really do hit like an absolute truck, so this could definitely help out if you find yourself getting hit a lot. Moving on to the stats I am going to recommend, we have 55 Vigor, 24 Mind, 30 Endurance, 56 Strength, 10 Dexterity, 25 Faith, and 19 Arcane. I think 55 Vigor is about the sweet spot you should have for Shadow of the Erdtree because everything hits like an absolute truck. You might be tempted to go for a bit higher than this, but Vigor really does have diminishing returns, so if you're considering that, I would just recommend you use a defensive talisman instead. We have 24 Mind here because all you really need FP for is spamming White Light Charge. It is pretty expensive, but with 24 Mind you will have enough to use the full version of it 4 times before you run out of FP, or 5 if you use the Carrion Filigree Crest. And I think that's just perfect for making it spammable without wasting too many points on FP. Now for the Endurance, I have 30, which some of you may consider to be low, but I really only gave myself enough to not fat roll, and that's about it. If you want to increase this a bit more for comfort, then you can definitely do that. Just take a couple points out of strength, but keep in mind that decreasing strength will lower your damage, so I would recommend trying 30 before you think about raising it any higher. Strength is of course our main stat, and I have 56 to try and get as much damage as possible. I honestly wish this was higher, but this is about the best we can do while keeping this build at a reasonable level of 150. If you are a higher level than that, then I would recommend putting some more points into strength just to really maximize your damage. For dexterity we have 10 because it's required to wield the weapon, and it's not worth putting any more into this stat because while it does increase our damage, the scaling is terrible. We of course have the classic 25 Faith, which is just enough so we can cast both Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for the massive offensive and defensive buffs that they provide. I include this with all of my builds because it's just that good. Then we have 19 Arcane, which is the bare minimum to wield the weapon. Increasing Arcane will increase our damage the same way Strength does, but the Arcane scaling is much lower than the Strength scaling, so I just went all in on Strength. I did spend the time to try and perfectly optimize the Strength to Arcane ratio for maximum damage, but the diminishing returns on the Strength stat never reach a point where Arcane is even worth investing a single point into. Perhaps the story would be different if our Strength was much higher, but for a level 150 build, it's just not worth it. Some people are probably wondering about Great Runes, and the 3 that I think are really worth considering are Godric's Great Rune, because we technically use 7 of 8 stats, and that could save you a lot of levels, or just make you quite a bit stronger. Morgoth's Great Rune is also good because it just gives you 25% more health, and who doesn't like 25% more health? But my personal choice is Radahn's Great Rune because it gives you 15% more health, FP, and stamina, which this build needs a lot of. And that brings us to the end of this build guide. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like and then check out this video next.